In the amber twilight of June 1899, in the provincial shadows of Vitebsk Governorate, a child was born who would one day orchestrate some of the most heinous atrocities in human memory. Bronislav Vladislavovich Kaminski emerged into a world already fracturing along ethnic and ideological lines, his Polish father and German mother unknowingly siring a man whose mixed heritage would become both his weapon and his curse. The Russian Empire that cradled his birth was already showing the hairline cracks that would soon split into revolution, civil war, and the rise of totalitarian nightmares. As the young Kaminski navigated the convulsions of his homeland through revolution and the catastrophic purges of Stalin's terror, his trajectory remained that of a minor bureaucrat, an engineer whose greatest ambitions seemed confined to technical drawings and administrative minutiae. Yet beneath this mundane exterior, resentments festered. The Soviet system, with its paranoid machinery of denunciation and disappearance, had marked him as suspect. The Great Purge of 1937 swept through Soviet society like a scythe through wheat, and Kaminski fell victim to Stalin's paranoia. Arrested on charges of counter-revolutionary activities, he was sentenced to 5 years in the Gulag archipelago. The NKVD file, discovered decades later by historian Alexander Dalin, recorded the prosecutor's words. The accused demonstrates persistent anti-Soviet attitudes and maintains dangerous connections to Kulak elements. When Adolf Hitler's legions crashed across the Soviet frontier on June 22, 1941, in what would become Operation Barbarossa, they encountered not only military resistance, but also pockets of Soviet citizens who viewed the Wehrmacht not as conquerors, but as liberators. In the town of Lokot, nestled in the contested borderlands between Russia and Ukraine, Kaminski found his moment. The German Einsatzgruppen and Wehrmacht units, stretched thin across the vast expanse of occupied territory, desperately needed local collaborators to maintain order in their rear areas. Konstantin Voskoboynik, a former Soviet school director and local party official who had turned against the Bolshevik regime, established what would become known as the Lokot Autonomy, a puppet state carved from the chaos of German occupation. As Voskoboynik proclaimed in an early manifesto, "We stand at the crossroads of history, where the choice between slavery under Stalin's yoke and freedom under German protection becomes clear." When partisan bullets ended Voskoboynik's life on January 8, 1942, Kaminski stepped forward to inherit this poisoned legacy, transforming what had been a modest local militia into something far more sinister. The German occupation authorities, led by commanders like General Rudolf Schmidt of the 2nd Panzer Army, initially viewed these Russian collaborators with skepticism. Schmidt noted in his correspondence to Army Group Center headquarters, "These auxiliary forces show enthusiasm but lack discipline. Their value remains questionable." Yet, as partisan activities intensified throughout 1942, the Germans found themselves increasingly dependent on local knowledge and manpower. Kaminski, with his engineering background and administrative skills, proved adept at organizing not merely a police force, but an entire shadow government. By the autumn of 1942, Kaminski's forces had grown from a handful of local militiamen to over 1,000 armed collaborators. The transformation of these men, many of them former Red Army soldiers, Soviet officials and displaced peasants, into instruments of Nazi policy, reflected the complex motivations driving collaboration: personal survival, ideological conversion, revenge against Soviet oppression, and simple opportunism. A German intelligence report from this period observed, "Kaminski has demonstrated remarkable organizational abilities in transforming disparate elements into a coherent anti-partisan force. His men show particular zeal in operations against Bolshevik partisans." The Lokot Autonomy under Kaminski's leadership became a grotesque experiment in Nazi colonial administration. German advisors worked alongside Russian collaborators to create a hybrid system that combined German racial ideology with Russian administrative structures. The territory, encompassing roughly 1.7 million inhabitants across 8 districts, functioned as both a buffer zone against partisan incursions and a laboratory for Nazi theories about governing conquered Slavic populations. Heinrich Himmler himself took interest in this experiment, seeing it as a potential model for the post-war administration of conquered Soviet territories. Blood in the birch forests, the anti-partisan war. The forests of Western Russia, thick with birch and pine, had become a vast battlefield where no quarter was asked or given. In these verdant depths, Soviet partisans conducted a shadow war against the German occupation, striking supply convoys, sabotaging railway lines, and assassinating collaborators. It was in this merciless theatre that Kaminski's forces would earn their reputation for brutality, transforming from auxiliary police into a full military formation known as the Russian Liberation People's Army, the RONA Brigade. The partisan commander Alexei Saburov, operating in the Bryansk forests, recorded in his diary the escalating viciousness of the conflict. The Kaminski bandits have introduced new horrors to our struggle. They know the land as we do, speak our language, understand our tactics. When they take prisoners, death comes slowly. The intimacy of this fratricidal conflict, Russians hunting Russians through familiar terrain, added layers of personal vengeance to an already savage war. Kaminski himself, now bearing the German rank of Waffen-Oberführer, had evolved from bureaucrat to warlord. German observers noted his transformation with a mixture of admiration and unease. SS Oberführer Eberhard Herf, liaison officer to the RONA Brigade, wrote to his superiors in Berlin, "Kaminski has become something beyond our initial expectations, part administrator, part bandit chief. His men follow him with the devotion of medieval retainers, and their methods in dealing with partisans exceed even our own standards of harsh necessity." The RONA Brigade's anti-partisan operations followed a pattern of escalating terror designed to drain the civilian sea in which partisan fish swam. Entire villages suspected of harboring partisan sympathizers were subjected to what the Germans euphemistically termed cleansing actions. The village of Klintsy, raided in March 1943, exemplified this brutal calculus. According to survivor testimony recorded by Soviet investigators, Kaminski's men surrounded the settlement at dawn, herded the population into the village square, and conducted interrogations that invariably ended in executions. Local RONA commander Pavel Svistunov reportedly told the assembled villagers, "You have chosen to feed the bandits in the forest. Now you will feed the crows." The partisan leader Maria Fortus, operating in the Sevsk region, witnessed the aftermath of a RONA sweep through her area. Her report to Soviet partisan headquarters painted a harrowing picture. They came at first light, approximately 200 men in German uniforms but speaking Russian. After the killing ended, they took everything: food, livestock, even children's clothing. The wells were fouled with corpses. This was not war, but extermination. Such accounts, multiplied across hundreds of villages throughout the occupied territories, testified to the systematic nature of RONA's campaign of terror. By the summer of 1943, intelligence reports suggested that Kaminski's brigade had grown to over 10,000 men, organized into infantry battalions, cavalry squadrons, and support units. The force included not only Russians, but also Ukrainians, Belarusians, and even some Poles, who had thrown their lot in with the Germans. This multi-ethnic composition reflected both the complexity of nationalist tensions in the region and the magnetic appeal of Kaminski's personal authority. German military records from this period reveal a growing ambivalence about their Russian allies. While acknowledging the tactical value of local knowledge and manpower, Wehrmacht and SS commanders increasingly expressed concern about the RONA Brigade's discipline and methods. General Kurt von Tippelskirch, commanding the Fourth Army, noted in his situation reports, "The Kaminski units are effective in the immediate tactical sense, but their excesses create long-term problems for maintaining civilian cooperation." The partisan war reached its crescendo in the spring and summer of 1943, as Soviet resistance networks coordinated increasingly sophisticated operations against German lines of communication. The Battle of Kursk, Hitler's last great offensive gamble on the Eastern Front, drew massive German resources southward, leaving rear area security increasingly dependent on collaborationist forces like RONA. Partisan commander Fyodor Ozmilov, coordinating operations behind German lines during this period, reported to Moscow, "The enemy relies heavily on Russian traitors who know our methods. These are not mere auxiliaries, but a full military force under German command." The thunder from the east, retreat and relocation. The failure of Operation Citadel at Kursk in July 1943 marked not merely a tactical defeat for German arms, but the beginning of an irreversible tide that would sweep away the entire Nazi edifice in the east. For Kaminski and his RONA Brigade, the thunderous Soviet artillery barrages echoing from the southern front carried an ominous message. The Reich's eastern adventure was crumbling, and with it, the foundations of their collaborationist state. On July 29, 1943, as Red Army spearheads pushed westward in the aftermath of their Kursk victory, Kaminski issued the order that would transform his brigade from a territorial militia into a mobile military force. "All personnel of the RONA Brigade and their families will prepare for immediate evacuation," his directive stated. "We move not in retreat, but toward a new phase of our struggle against Bolshevism." This carefully crafted language could not disguise the reality. The Lokot Autonomy was doomed, and its defenders must flee or face annihilation at the hands of Stalin's advancing armies. The evacuation that began in August 1943 resembled nothing so much as a biblical exodus, but one conducted under the shadow of approaching doom. Approximately 30,000 souls, RONA soldiers, local officials, their families, and civilians who had thrown their lot in with the German cause, began a desperate trek westward. The retreat exposed the fundamental contradictions in Nazi racial ideology. These ethnic Russians, whom Nazi doctrine classified as Untermensch, had become essential military allies whose preservation required significant German resources. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of racial persecution, found himself authorizing the evacuation and resettlement of a Russian militia force, a decision that would have been unthinkable in the confident early days of Barbarossa. His telegram to SS Oberführer Kurt von Gottberg, responsible for rear area security, reflected this paradox. The Kaminski formation represents a valuable asset that must be preserved for future anti-partisan operations. The evacuation route took Kaminski's forces through the blood-soaked battlefields of Western Russia and into the forests of Belarus, where German authorities had designated new operational areas for the displaced brigade. The journey itself became a trial of endurance, with stragglers falling victim to partisan ambushes, Soviet air attacks, and simple exhaustion. Anna Kirillova, a nurse attached to the RONA Brigade, later testified about the evacuation. "We moved like ghosts through a landscape of burned villages and abandoned positions. The sound of artillery never ceased, sometimes distant, sometimes terrifyingly close. Belarus, in the autumn of 1943, represented the epicenter of the partisan war. The region's dense forests and extensive swamplands provided ideal terrain for guerrilla operations, while the brutality of German occupation policies had driven thousands of civilians into active resistance." Partisan commander Kirill Orlovsky, operating in the Minsk region, reported to Moscow the arrival of Kaminski's forces. "A new enemy has appeared in our region, Russian traitors with extensive experience in anti-partisan warfare. They know our methods and show no mercy to civilians suspected of supporting our cause." The relocation to Belarus marked a new phase in RONA's evolution from territorial militia to specialized counterinsurgency force. German commanders, impressed by the brigade's performance in Russia, assigned it to some of the most challenging partisan-infested regions in occupied Belarus. SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, the higher SS and police leader responsible for anti-partisan operations in the East, took personal interest in the RONA Brigade's capabilities. His assessment, forwarded to Himmler's headquarters, was coldly professional. Kaminski's formation represents our most effective Russian collaborationist unit. Their knowledge of Slavic peasant psychology and partisan tactics makes them invaluable for rear area security operations. The winter of 1943 to 1944 saw RONA forces engaged in brutal sweeping operations through the Belarusian countryside. The campaign followed the same pattern of terror that had characterized their operations in Russia. Suspected partisan villages were surrounded, their populations subjected to interrogation and selection, and those deemed guilty of collaboration faced summary execution. German documentation from this period reveals the industrial scale of these operations. A situation report dated February 15, 1944, noted, RONA operations in Grid Square 47B resulted in 347 suspected partisans eliminated and 1,200 civilians relocated for interrogation. Partisan retaliation was swift and merciless. The forests of Belarus became a killing ground where RONA soldiers who ventured too far from their bases simply vanished, their fate recorded only in partisan reports. Even Timofeyev, a partisan intelligence officer, documented these operations. "We have declared a special war against the Russian traitors. No prisoner, no mercy. They have chosen their side and will face the consequences." The Warsaw Massacre. The summer of 1944 brought cascading disasters for Nazi Germany. The Normandy landings had opened a second front in the west, while in the east, the Red Army's Operation Bagration had shattered Army Group Center and brought Soviet forces to the gates of Warsaw. In this desperate hour, as the Reich's enemies pressed from all directions, Heinrich Himmler made a decision that would forever link Kaminski's name with one of the war's most horrific atrocities, the destruction of Warsaw. On August 1, 1944, as Soviet artillery thundered across the Vistula River, the Polish Home Army launched its bid for liberation. General Tadeusz Komorowski, commander of the Warsaw Uprising, hoped to present the advancing Soviets with a fait accompli, a free Polish capital secured by Polish arms. Instead, his 40,000 fighters would face not only the Wehrmacht, but some of the most brutal formations in Nazi service, including Kaminski's RONA Brigade and Oskar Dirlewanger's penal unit of convicted criminals and military prisoners. The German response to the Warsaw Uprising was coordinated by SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, a veteran of anti-partisan warfare whose methods had earned him both promotion and infamy. His initial orders, issued on August 1st, reflected the Nazi leadership's view of the uprising as an opportunity for a final solution to the Warsaw problem. The directive stated, "Every inhabitant of Warsaw is to be killed. The city is to be razed to the ground and thus set an example for the whole of Europe." Kaminski's RONA Brigade, transported from Belarus specifically for the Warsaw operation, numbered approximately 6,500 men when they arrived in the Polish capital. These battle-hardened veterans of anti-partisan warfare brought with them a reputation for savagery that preceded them into the burning streets of Warsaw. Their assignment to the Ochota and Wola districts would transform these residential neighborhoods into slaughterhouses where the boundary between military operations and genocide dissolved entirely. The initial assault on August 5, 1944, revealed the true nature of what would follow. Polish Home Army officer Truskiel, commanding the Warsaw district, later testified about the first encounters with RONA forces. These were not soldiers conducting military operations, but animals engaged in a ritual of destruction. They showed no interest in military objectives, only in killing and looting. The RONA troops, many of them intoxicated, swept through residential blocks with a systematic brutality that shocked even hardened SS veterans. Witness accounts from Polish civilians who survived the initial massacre paint a picture of deliberate terror designed to break the spirit of the uprising. Maria Warder, a nurse working in a makeshift hospital in Wola, recorded in her diary, "They came at dawn, shouting in Russian and German. First, they killed the wounded, bayoneting them in their beds. Then, they turned on the medical staff. Dr. Kowalski tried to show them his Red Cross armband. they cut off his hands with an axe. Such testimonies, collected by survivors and investigators, document not random violence but organized sadism. The massacre at the Wola District Hospital represented one of the most documented atrocities committed by RONA forces. Approximately 400 patients, medical staff and civilians who had sought shelter there were murdered over the course of 3 hours on August 5, 1944. Polish Red Cross worker Zofia Szymanska survived by hiding beneath corpses and later testified. The Russian soldiers, led by an officer who spoke Polish, divided the victims into groups. Were separated from adults, women were, before being shot. The killing continued until evening, with breaks only for looting and drinking. The savagery displayed by RONA forces during the Warsaw Uprising exceeded even the expectations of their German commanders. Bach-Zelewski himself, despite his years conducting anti-partisan operations, felt compelled to issue restraining orders. His directive of August 7, 1944 stated, "Excessive brutality serves no military purpose and creates unnecessary complications for maintaining order in occupied territories." However, these orders had little effect on troops whose bloodlust had been unleashed in the labyrinthine streets of burning Warsaw. Oskar Derlewanger, commanding the parallel formation of convicted criminals, observed the RONA Brigade's methods with professional interest. His report to SS headquarters noted, "The Russian formation shows remarkable initiative in terrorizing civilian populations. Their knowledge of Slavic psychology makes them particularly effective in breaking civilian morale." The collaboration between Derlewanger's and Kaminski's units created a synergy of violence that multiplied the horror visited upon Warsaw's population. Polish resistance leader Jan Nowak, who infiltrated German lines to document atrocities for the London government in exile, reported, "The Russian collaborators under Kaminski have introduced methods of systematic terror that exceed anything we have previously witnessed. Entire apartment blocks are cleared floor by floor, with residents subjected to torture before execution. Women and children receive no mercy." RONA's violent dissolution. As Warsaw burned through the terrible months of August and September 1944, Heinrich Himmler began to recognize that his experiment with Slavic collaboration had produced a monster beyond his control. The RONA Brigade's excesses in Poland had created diplomatic complications even within the Nazi hierarchy, where competing factions sought scapegoats for the Reich's mounting disasters. Kaminski, the ambitious engineer who had risen from provincial obscurity to command thousands, found himself caught in the web of Nazi power struggles that would ultimately consume him. The reports reaching SS headquarters painted a disturbing picture of RONA behavior during the Warsaw suppression. Even by the brutal standards of Nazi anti-partisan warfare, Kaminski's men had distinguished themselves through acts of savage cruelty that served no military purpose. SS Oberführer Heinz Reineffath, coordinating the German assault on Warsaw's Wola district, filed increasingly urgent reports about RONA discipline. His communication of August 12, 1944 stated, "The Kaminski formation has become a liability to our operations. Their actions exceed operational necessity and threaten to compromise our ability to maintain order among remaining Polish civilian populations." Bach-Zelewski, caught between his superiors' demands for effective suppression of the uprising and the diplomatic fallout from RONA atrocities, began to view Kaminski as expendable. The SS commander's calculation was coldly practical. The Russian collaborator had served his purpose in Warsaw's destruction, but had become too dangerous to control. Hitler's growing paranoia about foreign volunteers in German service provided convenient justification for eliminating a potentially troublesome subordinate. The charges against Kaminski when they came reflected both legitimate concerns about military discipline and the Nazi regime's need for a scapegoat. Accusations included unauthorized executions of German personnel, systematic looting of civilian property, and failure to maintain unit discipline during combat operations. More significantly, intelligence reports suggested that Kaminski had been conducting secret negotiations with contacts in neutral countries, possibly seeking to position himself for the post-war period. On August 19, 1944, as the Warsaw Uprising entered its third week, Kaminski received orders to report to German headquarters in Łódź for what was ostensibly a routine conference on future operations. The summons came from Bachzylewski personally, carried by SS courier, and couched in language that suggested promotion rather than prosecution. Kaminski's response to this invitation revealed either supreme confidence or fatal naivety. His aide-de-camp later recalled, "The Oberfuhrer seemed pleased by the summons. He spoke of new responsibilities and expressed satisfaction with our performance in Warsaw. The journey from Warsaw to Łódź took Kaminski through a landscape devastated by 4 years of occupation and warfare. The Polish countryside bore witness to the systematic destruction of European civilization, abandoned villages, burned forests, and mass graves that had become the Reich's true monuments. German military police who escorted the RONA commander noted his apparent mood of optimism, seemingly unaware that he was traveling to his own execution. In Łódź, the apparatus of Nazi justice moved with characteristic efficiency. The charges against Kaminski were prepared by SS legal officers who had extensive experience in constructing cases against troublesome foreign volunteers. The indictment, classified until captured by Allied forces after the war, accused the Russian commander of conduct unbecoming an officer of the Waffen-SS, unauthorized appropriation of military supplies, and failure to maintain discipline within his command. More serious but unspecified charges related to treasonous communications with enemy agents. The court-martial proceedings, such as they were, consumed less than 24 hours. Kaminski was not permitted legal representation, nor was he allowed to call witnesses in his defense. The three-officer tribunal, headed by SS Oberfuhrer Friedrich Jeckeln, himself a mass murderer who would later be executed by the Soviets, heard testimony from German officers who had worked with the RONA Brigade. Their testimonies, while acknowledging the unit's tactical effectiveness, uniformly condemned its lack of discipline and its commander's alleged disloyalty to the Reich. On August 28, 1944, Bronislav Kaminski was executed by firing squad in a courtyard of the Łódź Municipal Building. The death warrant, signed by Bachzylewski and approved by Himmler's headquarters, stated that the condemned had failed in his duties as a German officer and brought dishonor upon the Waffen-SS. The execution squad consisted of German SS personnel, ensuring that no Russians were present to witness the end of their commander. The disposal of Kaminski's remains reflected the Nazi regime's desire to erase all traces of its embarrassing experiment with Slavic collaboration. His body was cremated immediately, the ashes scattered without ceremony or record. Official German records listed his death as killed in action during anti-partisan operations, maintaining the fiction of honorable military service even as they eliminated the inconvenient truth of his execution. News of Kaminski's death reached the remaining RONA forces in Warsaw through unofficial channels, creating confusion and demoralization among troops already exhausted by weeks of brutal urban warfare. Many RONA soldiers, recognizing that their protection had vanished with their commander's death, began deserting their positions or attempting to surrender to Polish forces. German officers, faced with the disintegration of a formation they had relied upon, scrambled to maintain operational effectiveness in the face of continued Polish resistance. The execution of Bronislav Kaminski marked not merely the death of a collaborationist leader, but the beginning of the end for the entire RONA experiment. The remaining elements of the Russian Liberation People's Army, scattered across Poland and Belarus, found themselves leaderless in a rapidly collapsing Reich where their services were no longer needed, and their foreign origins made them increasingly suspect to paranoid Nazi authorities. Colonel Ivan Frolov, the senior surviving Russian officer, attempted to maintain unit cohesion by denying reports of his commander's execution, claiming instead that Kaminski had been promoted to higher headquarters. His deception, recorded in intercepted German communications, lasted barely a week before desertion rates made continued operations impossible. A German situation report dated September 5, 1944, noted, "RONA formation combat effectiveness has declined to approximately 30% of previous levels. Widespread desertion and disciplinary problems make the unit unsuitable for further operations." The collaboration phenomenon embodied by Kaminski and his followers illuminated the deepest fractures within Soviet society, the resentments created by collectivization, the terror unleashed by purges, and the alienation bred by ideological extremism. Yet, as historian Timothy Snyder observed in his analysis of Eastern European violence, explanation is not exoneration. Understanding why people collaborated does not diminish the moral weight of their choices or reduce the suffering of their victims. The remaining RONA personnel were distributed among various German formations, their Russian identities submerged within the broader category of Eastern volunteers, Ostfreiwillige, that the Wehrmacht used to disguise the extent of its reliance on Soviet collaborators. Some were transferred to General Andrei Vlasov's Russian Liberation Army, though the ideological differences between Kaminski's peasant nationalism and Vlasov's pan-Russian vision created friction within the ranks. Others found themselves assigned to fortress battalions defending German positions along the Atlantic Wall, their experience in anti-partisan warfare deemed irrelevant to the requirements of static defense. The fate of individual RONA veterans reflected the broader tragedy of collaboration in the Nazi Empire. Those who survived the war's end faced different forms of retribution depending upon which Allied forces captured them. Soviet authorities, guided by Stalin's decree that collaboration was treason, showed no mercy to returned prisoners. NKVD interrogator Major Alexei Petrov, processing captured RONA personnel in 1945, reported, "These traitors show no remorse for their crimes against the Soviet people. Their claims of coercion under German pressure are rejected. All will face maximum punishment under Soviet law." Western Allied forces, while not implementing the immediate execution that awaited RONA veterans in Soviet custody, nonetheless recognized the severity of the crimes committed by Kaminski's formation. The documentary evidence of RONA crimes began accumulating even before the war's end, as Polish investigators and Soviet intelligence services compiled testimonies from survivors of the brigade's operations. Dr. Władysław Bartoszewski, working with the Polish government in exile to document German atrocities, interviewed hundreds of Warsaw Uprising survivors whose accounts consistently highlighted the particular brutality of Russian collaborators. His preliminary report, filed in London in early 1945, stated, "The Kaminski formation introduced methods of systematic terror that exceeded even the notorious Dirlewanger unit in their calculated cruelty towards civilian populations." Soviet historian Colonel Pavel Sudoplatov, analyzing captured German documents after the war, placed RONA atrocities within the broader context of Nazi collaboration policy. His classified assessment for Stalin noted, "The Kaminski experiment demonstrated both the potential and limitations of using Soviet collaborators for occupation duties. While tactically effective, such formations proved impossible to control once their bloodlust was unleashed." The final accounting of RONA crimes would never be complete, as the chaos of war and the deliberate destruction of evidence by retreating German forces obscured the full scope of the brigade's activities. Estimates compiled by post-war investigators suggested that Kaminski's forces had participated in the deaths of approximately 50,000 civilians during their 3 years of operation, with the majority of these casualties occurring during anti-partisan sweeps in Russia and Belarus and the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising. The story of Bronislav Kaminski and his RONA Brigade stands as one of the most disturbing chapters in the larger narrative of collaboration during World War II. Their trajectory from Soviet citizens to Nazi auxiliaries to perpetrators of genocide illuminates the complex motivations and moral compromises that characterized life under totalitarian rule. Yet, it also demonstrates how quickly the machinery of persecution could transform victims into victimizers, creating cycles of violence that consumed both the innocent and the guilty. The ultimate fate of the brigade, destroyed by the very Nazi regime it had served so faithfully, reflected the inherent contradictions in German racial policy that simultaneously exploited and despised Slavic collaborators. Kaminski's execution demonstrated that even the most useful foreign auxiliaries remained expendable in the Nazi hierarchy, their services valued only as long as they served German interests without threatening German control. In the end, the rise and fall of the RONA Brigade stands as a testament to the depths of moral degradation possible when ordinary individuals surrender their humanity to serve as instruments of state terror and the inevitable reckoning that awaits those who choose to walk that path of darkness.